here. So again, welcome to First Tuesdays. Looks like we have a few more people logging in. Great, welcome. I will be your facilitator today, Jeremy Stroud. My information is there on screen. I'll type it into chat as soon as I pass off the microphone. Your technical support today is Joe Olivar. Say hi, Joe.
Hi, Joe.
First Tuesdays is brought to you by the Washington Secretary of State, Washington State Library, with funds provided by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, LSTA Funder Act. So real quickly, thank you. Can everyone hear me all right? I was just had somebody tell me I was a bit quiet here, so I wanted to make sure. Okay. So if I can have everyone type into chat the number of participants that are currently at your location if you're sharing a computer, and then what library or organization you're with, or the city and state if you're not here from an organization. Further, after the presentation, we will have a short 4 or 5 question follow-up survey. It will be right here in Blackboard. You don't need to go anywhere for that. If you could quickly fill that out for us, we'd much appreciate it. So I'm going to give everyone a couple minutes here to fill out where you're from, and then we'll continue on. Excellent. Thank you, everyone. Do that. Okay, so today's presenter is Maggie Faber, and I apologize, Maggie, I forgot to ask how to pronounce your last name, so I hope that was correct.
That was correct.
All right, fantastic. She's the Data Visualization and Analysis Librarian at the University of Washington. And I'm going to go ahead and let you do the rest of your introduction here, because that's all I have for you. But please take it away, Maggie.
Thank you. So yeah, as they said, I'm Maggie Faber, and I'm really excited that you guys are here to learn about Choose Your Own Adventure style information literacy tutorials. So to start with, I'm just assuming that everyone here is at least a little familiar with Choose Your Own Adventure books. If you use your little poll drop down to just yes or no, that would be super helpful, because I can give a okay, it's looking like everyone is. So I'll give almost everyone is. I'll give a quick recap, and then we can move on. So let me just navigate. Okay, so Choose Your Own Adventure books were this sort of popular version of what's called interactive fiction, and it basically lets the reader pick their path through the story. So they're nonlinear. They basically have these options where you say, if you want to do XYZ action, you turn to page 42. If you want to do this other thing, turn to page 140. And they came out around the 80s, although there were a few interactive fiction experiments before this, but this really popularized it. And they're actually still making them. So on the left you can see all of the sort of vintage classics. And on the right they're making sort of rebranded ones. They have Choose Your Own Nightmare, and they have sort of early reader Choose Your Own Adventure for younger kids. So they also have, the genre is not just Choose Your Own Adventure, so they have a lot of competitions for interactive fiction more broadly. So there's 2 notable awards that have been around since 1995 and 1996. These are some recent winners. You can click on the links to, I'm actually not positive you can click the links from these slides. I should have checked that.
Slides, unfortunately.
Okay. Sorry about that. Well, I've made the links visible for the other one, so it's not too hard to track them down. And then there's also, I mean, obviously with the internet and digital technology, there's a lot of apps and online versions of this as well, because it's a lot less of a barrier to entry. So I have given you just a little bit of background on this topic, I hope that's enough to kind of get the concept. So for this presentation, I'm going to start out giving you some of the context for the project that I worked on in particular at the University of British Columbia, and then go over some of the design and analysis challenges and opportunities that we encountered as we were working through this, and then give you just a few recommendations for getting started if you're interested in starting your own. So, in the summer of 2015, Catherine Miller and I, who is a biology librarian at University of British Columbia, were working on a teaching and learning enhancement funded revamp of the land and food systems asynchronous learning resources. Sorry, that's quite a mouthful. So the grant was focused on interactive materials and responsive feedback, but the library's piece of this collaboration was kind of hampered by the content management system. So they had it in Blackboard, and they had a particularly restrictive version where you could only allow a single path through the content. And the grant was all about interactivity and multimodality, so so this was posing quite a bit of a problem. This is an example of kind of stage 2 of the tutorial. So before I came onto the project, a student in the previous year had done some initial work on the content, and they had done some soft revisions. So the lower left box was kind of the original content, and then they added this sort of narrative piece off to the right, and then a sort of how can I use this contextual piece based on some of the student assessment that they had done. They had done a card sorting exercise to see how students were putting together this information, and they were just doing some kind of interviews to talk through what they felt like their stumbling blocks were in their research process. One of the main issues was actually not so much a lack of tools, but a lack of confidence. So one of the key findings was that most students apologized at some point in any of their conversations for the research process, how they sorted the information, and had a lot of fear about doing research wrong. So they said the process seemed to be intimidating to them and one that they wanted to do correctly, but feared to do poorly. So for that reason, one of our key priorities was to reinforce student choices at every step of the way. So to say, no matter what you choose to do, even if you go to Google first before you go to the library, that's the right decision for you. So we wanted to try and reinforce their choices, improve existing habits if there were opportunities, but not introducing a bunch of new, this is the only best way to do it. There were a few other problems as well. So the Land and Food Systems faculty and Catherine Miller, the librarian, were working together fairly closely, but there was no way for Catherine to get any aggregate information about the content that she was producing for them. So she basically had no way of seeing if anyone even clicked on the materials that she was creating. The teacher could only look at student engagement one by one, so there was no aggregate class information either. And there was no way to see what might need to be revised after information resources had been in the content management system for a while. So our solution was kind of an evolving one. We had begun to explore some alternate assessment methods within Blackboard when a colleague presented her work using a survey platform to do quizzing. And we realized that the fact that you could embed a survey within Blackboard and the fact that the survey platform had branching logic meant that we could use that structure to kind of pull up different content at different points depending on student responses. So we initially explored just using the choose your own adventure style sort of multimodality as just a way of navigating the existing content. But as we started talking with faculty and with students, they seemed to get really excited about the choose your own adventure itself. So we kind of embraced that and designed this as just an experiment to to meet all of these goals that we were kind of working through. So these were some of our initial priorities. Our initial list was about 10 items long, so it was huge, but we streamlined it down to really answer some of the problems coming out of the previous assessment and coming out of what the grant was intended to do. So reinforcing choices, making sure that students could get more help where they wanted it and less help if they felt like they had mastered a concept. And I was going to kind of jump ahead and give you guys a preview of what we ended up actually doing. So this is the final version. I think this should work. Can you guys see this web tour thing? So feel free to explore. I'll give you maybe 5 or 6 minutes. It's fairly short, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But this was the penultimate version of this tutorial, and feel free to explore it. And you can take it as many times as you want if you just refresh the page. And I'll keep track of time and stop talking.
We can actually set a timer if you'd like.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you.
You said 5 minutes, or I'm sorry, how long?
Yeah, that'd be great. And if people don't need it, you can just say, like, I'm done in the chat, and I can kind of not take as much time.
A minute and a half left if folks haven't gotten through it all yet.
Okay, it looks like everyone's finishing up and we're only 6 seconds away, so I'll just start talking again. But I wanted to, sorry, I don't know if you heard that, but it dings really loud. So I first wanted to ask whether there were any questions coming out of that. So some of the design features that we, oh great, feel free to ask them. I have a scheduled question time. But we made up this fictional creature to have people research because they seemed to respond well to that. We had a really light tone, so we had this embedded in the traditional content, so we wanted this to feel fresher and to feel different. We gave it fairly restrictive paths, so you know, there were choices in there, like you could look at Google Images, but Google Images was going to really quickly shoot you back to the main content. And that way, you know, when we were designing it, we were pretty big fans of choose your own adventure stories, so we remembered taking kind of every obstinate path before you did what you wanted. So we wanted to make sure that people who enjoyed that style still had a little bit of that without making a huge amount of labor for ourselves. And then I don't know if anyone saw this, but we had some of what I kind of call the edges of the tutorial. So this was a pilot project, and we had a lot of questions about whether it was worth doing and whether we wanted to continue to support it in an ongoing way. So there were these points in the tutorial where we said, you know, we don't have any more content here, but you know, both of these choices will take you back to the main content. You can select take me back, and also I wish there was more content here, or just take me back. Or sometimes like take me back, no, I hate this. But we didn't have a ton of that. So so those were some of the design features, and you may have seen some of them or none of them. But that was kind of how we were thinking about this, in case that answered any of your questions. But if there were specific questions, I'm happy to answer them right now. All right, I'm not seeing any in the chat, but if you just type them, I'll pay attention to them when they pop up.
There's one right there.
Oh, great. So thank you. So this was built in Fluid Surveys, which was the survey platform that that UBC had a license to. I've also recreated it in Qualtrics, which is the survey tool that my current institution works with. So I think any survey platform that has the ability to use branching logic would work. We also found, as I'll kind of go over a little bit later, a couple of tools that are natively built for this style content. So this is kind of an adoption of surveys for a different purpose. If you don't need to track it as carefully, a program like Twine makes it really easy to build these sort of interactive branches, but doesn't track any information about what those choose. And then to import it into Blackboard, our survey just had an embed code. So we used iframes or an embedded web page. I can't remember what we decided on, but both of those worked, and it was just a matter of what visual style we liked the best. And we did create maps. We created many maps, so I will show you those shortly. If I just toggle back to my presentation. Is that here? Great. Okay, so that was kind of the context. Here's sort of how we did what we did. So one of the many challenges of this project, and this was an evolving process, so I think if you know going in that this is what you want to do, it might be a little easier. But our big challenges were talking about it with each other, collaboratively drafting it, and implementing it, so not hard at all. So in talking about it, we started out with this kind of flow chart, but as you can see, it's not all that useful for communicating. We also used this force-directed layout, which was even worse. And then we finally ended up realizing that we were spending so much time trying to get an overview of what we were doing that we weren't actually doing it. So we ended up just kind of letting it be a single brain, like writing and implementing it in the survey platform. And then once it kind of was out there, we kind of collaborated on like the exact language, the exact concepts, and where those fit in. So, so mapping this was actually pretty difficult, but I'll show you later. Actually, maybe I can jump to this. Yeah, so I'll just jump here. What slide am I on? Okay, I want to make sure I can get back. So this picture here from Twine is the Twine version. So this is the program that is designed for Choose Your Own Adventure. And you can see our sort of overall structure, which was this branch and bottleneck. So we have these choices that students can choose, and then they choose to kind of see whether they want more information on something or to skip ahead. But every student who completes it will see these four sort of central nodes. And so Twine automatically generates this map, which is really useful, but it doesn't track any of the information. So I was here. So our final implementation was 42 questions or contents with those four kind of main big hubs. There were 116 possible responses and 59 branching rules controlling how and what the content, like what content appeared and when. And drafting the rules itself was probably one of the hardest parts. So you can see this is a screenshot from the various survey platforms that I've experimented with this. This top one was from Fluid Surveys, and it shows all of the rules governing just the first page. So all of the questions that you got before you clicked onto Google. And then this screenshot right below it shows how those rules are constructed. So this is saying if your first choice says summon search, then you show this other node. And then in Qualtrics, which is the other program that I've worked with, it's constructed slightly differently. So instead of starting from the question and showing what appears, you start from the response and say when the response shows up. So it's framed a little differently, but it's the same concept and can be implemented that way. Each question has 1 to 5 possible responses, even though many of them like I said, do lead students to the same place. And this did allow us to embed those questions for feedback throughout the tutorial, not just at the very end. It also allowed the librarian to see, we had a couple, maybe you saw this, a couple of points where we could say, like, actually the information is getting a little overwhelming, or actually I need you to slow down, and then we could kind of distribute the information at a slightly different pace. We didn't build this in such a robust way that we could have like a totally parallel structure with it a little bit slower and more less detailed, but we did kind of give them resources for, like, if you need to look this up later, here's where you can go, to kind of mitigate some of the information overload. I think that answered that question pretty thoroughly. I sort of previewed this. We did find additional tools throughout the process that might have been worth exploring earlier. If you're interested in doing this yourself, as I'll say later, I think Twine is a great program to draft in because it's built for this kind of thing. But since ours was first and foremost an assessment project and we needed to get the data out, it wasn't able to be our final implementation. Quest is a slightly different approach, but it is still similar to this, so I thought it was worth mentioning. Quest kind of has that you're exploring a room functionality. So if you wanted students to pick up things and interact with things or click on certain things, Quest might be a great tool. We didn't end up using it because we were so far along in the process down this other way, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So moving into the analysis, I kind of wanted to share some of the results that we got before moving into the struggles that we had to get there. So these were our sort of first year results. So we reached 279 students in our first year with a 53% completion rate. So that alone was way more information than we had before. One of the interesting results was of the people who abandoned the survey, more than half of them left after the first question. So these were people who answered, I want to go to Google, clicked next, and then left. So we sort of understood this as being the people who don't like this content are able to self-select out, which is pretty great. They don't need this if it's not working for them, but the people that do complete it and do engage, you can see at the end we had a 79% positive response, and the positive response we got was like really strong. It's not just this was fine. And of the negative responses, by far the biggest one was I don't have strong feelings, or I don't really think I would like a tutorial, period. And we did, throughout the survey, about half of the students requested similar content or additional content, which was pretty remarkable. So in terms of a pilot experiment, I think we found this was fairly successful. This also gave us a lot of information about student research habits and whether they knew about certain things. So we had a point where we asked whether students knew that Google had advanced searching options, and 82% of them did. So they might not be using it, but it helps us to know we don't need to belabor the point that this exists. We can just talk about how to use it better. And then students, we had the version that you took was on the public website. We had a version that was specifically for students, and we did a little bit of comparing responses. And we don't know where the public results were coming from, but it was pretty interesting to see that students had fairly even coverage. This is from the student results, fairly even coverage in terms of what they were comfortable using, including Boolean, which was really popular and might have been because we had just talked about it in the tutorial, but was still exciting. But certainly more familiarity and more range of tools that they were comfortable with than the general public. We were able to get sort of insight into where in the process some of these choices came up. So most people clicked Google right away, and so they didn't see any of the content on the second page. or the library search and syllabus content on that first page. So we ended up, after we saw a couple of results like that, we ended up moving some of that content to the end. So after you get kind of the chance to explore the Google results, if you still want to see the content, instead of looping all the way back to the beginning, we have a kind of modified version towards the end. And students seem to have good habits, so they 19% moved to Wikipedia, but most preferred to move into journal articles and encyclopedias. We did try and caution them because we were starting with this concept that this is something they don't know anything about, that moving straight into journal articles might have been a little bit premature, but again, with that sense of reinforcing their choices and also recognizing that actual habits are not generally coming out of complete blue. And then we were also really pleased that students were very curious. So I think our impression of the tutorial content was that it might have been kind of stale, or that students were really like bored and ready to get out of here as soon as possible. But there were most students students who knew the answers to things were interested in exploring further, by and large, to see if there was something that they missed. And we found that this was a really good way of sharing things they don't know. And it wasn't just us trying to enforce that on them, it was them kind of soliciting that in a way that was really rewarding to see. So to get all of this, though, was a bit of a challenge. So one of the themes of the analysis was that it was really quite difficult to figure out how to work with this information, but got easier the more we did it and the more we tried to establish a template. So we ended up developing a couple of tools that I'll show you in a minute, and those tools worked great so long as they mapped onto the tutorial content really well. But this is a snapshot of the data extract that we got from our survey program. And you can see that there's a lot of gaps. There's a lot of, it's a little bit hard to analyze in a normal spreadsheet way or in visualization. And some of these issues in this red box, you can see that all of these choices lead to the same point, so everyone can move on to their syllabus, but you can do it by going to the syllabus first or clicking something else and then moving into the syllabus. You can also see that gaps don't necessarily mean the same thing. So that first student in the green picked 4 things right away and then abandon the survey, which you can only tell because the Google landing is a mandatory node, whereas this blue box is all of the people who picked Google fairly early on. So there's a lot of blanks because it's content they were never shown, but then they did in fact go on to complete the rest of the tutorial. So working with the data from this is a little bit disorienting and requires you to know fairly well what it is that you're asking students to do and what it is that links between those points. This was the visualization tool that we ended up with. So the simpler you make your survey, the simpler your analysis will be, but it will also give you less insight into their kind of choices and behaviors and preferences. So what you're looking at here is a Sankey diagram at the top that shows the flow of students between the different points of the tutorial. So this is an overview page that just shows the mandatory nodes. So you can see of the people who selected Google in the first question, how did they respond in that first constriction node second. And I think this is a little bit harder to see, so I also showed you this one, which is that taking the tutorial sort of section by section. And you can see here as you drop off, like the overall graph shows the overall response rate and where the kind of biggest abandonment points in the survey are. And then you can see, since Google is the next restriction node, you can sort of see a high volume of students go straight there. The next biggest go there after 2 or after 1 question. And then there's this handful of, I think of them as power users, but I don't think that really means anything, but who seem to be determined to explore as far as they can. So there's not a ton of them, so if you didn't want to design for that, I think it would be totally worth it. I think that would be totally justified, but we were pleased to see that it was still being used, even if it was I'm just going to go back one. So you can see the completion rate is changing, and that shows the completion rate for the tutorial overall versus the tutorial segment. And these numbers are slightly different from the numbers I was reporting earlier because this does show the public and the students in the same one. But you can see there's interactive filters here. I just remembered I could do this, so sorry. I was gesturing with my mouse before. But there are interactive filters here, so if you want to see just the undergrad or just the grad students, you can select those bars. You can select particular courses. You can see the exact numbers and the percent overall. And this down here is kind of a breakdown of the overall response. This doesn't change based on because it's an overall response, but this does show you what points in the tutorial you're looking at. We also, you can't see this here, but if people want to do another web tour and interact with it, you can hover over any of these points or lines to see the exact text of the tutorial. So we found that it was still pretty disorienting to look at this information. So this allowed us to kind of figure out where we were and what we were looking at and how they got there. So actually, I do want to do just a yes/no poll. Does anyone want to spend a few minutes to look at the interactive dashboard online, or do you feel like you got the concept? I guess yes, look at the dashboard, no, don't. And if you can just collect the poll. All right, it's looking like most people don't. So I've put a link here, so when they make the slides available, the person who was the yes can go look it up themselves. All right. So some recommendations for getting started. So if you're convinced and want to do this yourself, yes, Jeremy, I will send that. Sorry. I would say start out by thinking about what resources you have available. So most institutions have a survey license. Making sure you know what it's capable of doing and what you're comfortable learning about the program is a great place to start. And then figuring out what is most important for a kind of this approach to information literacy. So if you want to track student engagement, it'll be really important to do something that has data tracking. If gamification is more important and you just kind of want to liven it up, it might not be important, and you can use a tool that's a little bit easier to use. I kind of think of these in opposed pairs, so in-depth assessment versus sustainability and ease of use, comprehensiveness in terms of how many choices you want to offer students versus the demand that it takes to develop it. So a simpler linear survey is obviously going to be a lot easier than something with a million branching paths. And then based on kind of those key priorities, I would say pick the tool that makes sense for you. I found that the easiest to use, I guess, tool is Twine, which I've mentioned a couple of times. But if you want to do that sort of in-depth analysis and are willing to take the time to kind of figure it out and visualize it and communicate a really detailed pilot, once you have a template, it can be easier to upload responses each year. Although, again, difficult once you revise the content itself. If you're not already familiar with Choose Your Own Adventure work, I would read some. I think that the award winners are always really fun and interesting to see how they conceptualize it, and figuring out what you respond to and what you find amusing is going to be a good way to translate that into the content that you're presenting. One of my favorites is called Choice of the Dragon by The Choice of Games, and if you read that, you can see how much of that sort of style I ended up adopting in mine. These are some examples from other, so as I've spoken about this work, anyone who's doing this, I think, tends to talk about it. So we presented a panel a little over a year ago now that was talking about some Choose Your Own Adventure content that had been developed. And these each have a very different style. So this one here is a Intro to Philosophy workshop that's partially online and partially facilitated by the librarian, and is a largely linear survey, and students just select, I think at the beginning they can select a kind of topic or gender that they want to be as they explore, but then throughout the tutorial they are doing some research online and entering the answers into this, so it's sort of a semi-structured predominantly linear tutorial, and that's at the University of Washington, a colleague of mine. The Alchemy engine is actually built by some computer science students at the University of British Columbia, and it's used for chemistry homework problems. And the teachers will write out a set of questions for their homework, and then students will work through them. And that's sort of a program that is built to do Choose Your Own Adventure in a highly academic way, and students are actually graded on their performance. And then at the University of Winnipeg, Ian Fraser does a live Choose Your Own Adventure just in PowerPoint. So he'll have participants take just a hand vote and then jump to that point in the presentation and give a little bit information about the city and the library and that relationship. And then I have compiled a couple of resources. So I have one on my blog, and you can download the Twine file for the tutorial that you just took, or take the Twine version of the tutorial as well. And that's available at the UBC LibGuide. I didn't actually say this, even though it was in my notes, so I'll just say it now. The UBC had the survey version of the tutorial for the first year of the program, and then the context changed. So the faculty ended up adopting a different content management system that was able to give Catherine a lot more information about the tutorial use outside of Blackboard. So I think they moved to WordPress. And we had explored Twine and decided not to use it and used the survey, and then she actually went back to Twine later because it was easier to make changes in. And once she was able to get tracking information from another source, she didn't need to have all of it on the tutorial itself. So it doesn't have to be a lifelong commitment. It can be kind of an evolving process as your institutional needs change as well. So I think there should be a few minutes for questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit over where I wanted to go for questions, but if there are any questions, I can answer those now.
We have Becca typing, it looks like. Abby, a few people are typing questions or comments. Okay, from Abby and Jane, could you restate Catherine's experience in the end? Did she stick with Twine or use question mark?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yes, so they're still using Twine. They have Twine embedded in several LibGuides right now, and an archived version of the tutorial on Blackboard and the WordPress site. So they have, it looks and feels the same, at least the last time I checked it out, but the Twine is basically a browser-based program. So the way that drafting it works is you have to download the file and upload it into Twine, and then you can make revisions. So they kind of email a single file back and forth, but then that is the file that is populated to all of these LibGuides and programs. And that was the same process with the survey code, but I think we made the process a lot more complicated because we gave each class and each, like public versus academic, a different version of the exact same survey. So I think by the end of that year, they were just excited to have one very simple version. And so they are sticking with Twine, at least for now, and that is still up on their sites.
Becca had a question here. I'm
Okay.
wondering if you've ever considered an interactive tutorial builder such as Guide on the side or LiveWizard. I believe GOTS enables nonlinear pathways. Also, I put up our follow-up survey while everyone's still in the room. If you can fill this out while we continue with the Q&A.
So I haven't worked with those. I think it would be a completely sensible process to build it in an interactive tutorial builder. In both of my roles, so I work in the assessment department, and so in both of the contexts that I've been working in, we've been sort of bounded by the content management system we had rather than being able to pick something different. And as far as I know, the survey was the only thing we were able to embed, and then once we broke out of that, it was just easier to use it in the program that they already had a draft in. But I am excited to look those up, and I think if that's something that you have access to or you're more familiar with, I think it would absolutely be a great idea to use those. And then I see Suzanne says, suggestions for how to use Choose Your Own Adventure for assessing students while still keeping it a positive experience. The way that we approached this was to kind of give the narrator a sort of sense of humor, or at least a sense of humor as far as we were concerned. So we, in one of the paths through the tutorial, we allow students to use, we refer to using Google a lot, but at some point we give students a choice to say, like, actually I want to use Bing. And we had a handful of students choose that, and basically the only content that we had there was like, okay, great, you can use Bing so long as you use your imagination, and try and make it a little bit silly, and then just kind of move on. So I think the way that we thought about it was an opt-in to the humor, and I mean, like I said, we made up a creature. We made up like the Encyclopedia of Cryptozoology to research this made-up creature. So I think having it kind of gamified in terms of the content helped us keep a sort of lightness that we think. I mean, the students who responded seemed to have a positive experience. But I don't think, I think a lot of the positive experience was probably from just having something a little bit different. I know that the librarian at UW has said that students really enjoyed her presentation as well, and that was a much more formal, like she had sort of pages of text that they were reading, and was a little bit more lyrical, given that it was a philosophy context, and I think that also worked really well. So, so I hope that answers your question. But we also left a lot of encouragement, like that was a great choice. Do you want to learn more about how to use this choice even better? I think kind of kept the positivity and hopefully confidence building. Oh, I didn't know we had access to LiveWizard. That's great. Sorry. And then did we assign grades for this? We didn't. The professor in the land and food system gave a sort of mandatory, like they were able to see on a student-by-student basis whether they completed the tutorial, and they did have, like this was a piece of a larger assignment, so they had to take the tutorial and then write up a piece about, I'm trying to remember, like why and how they chose particular information resources for their final project. And they had sort of designed that assignment with Catherine, but I'm not sure she actually ended up getting to see the results from that. So there was the the piece that I was working on did not have a specific grade, but the kind of overall information literacy module did have a grade. I hope that answers your question.
All right, looks like we still have some folks typing. Great. Looks like folks just have general comments there. If you're assuming you're reading them all, Maggie.
Yes, I am. And actually, the instructional design team has reached out to me, and they're considering doing something. So I think that would be really exciting to see. I forgot who said this. Becca. Thanks. Yeah, and thank you. I really enjoyed giving this presentation, and thank you all for attending.
Well, thank you, Maggie. It looks like that's the end of the questions. I'm going to go ahead and turn off recording. Thank you, everyone, for